evening. This is Mae Brussell. This is July 21st in 1978 in Carmel, side 1, number 338, tape number 338. Several weeks ago, when I was on KGO with Bob Trevor, somebody called in and asked me if I had any information on the Metro Plan. It's called the 1313 Plan. And what did I think of it? They brought up the subject, and it took me by surprise because I didn't have any books on the Metro Plan in my library. That is the plan to divide the country into regional government. I just had never owned any of the books, and with the massive amount of literature I have, I was not aware that there was so much out about the Metro Plan. I try to keep up on these things. And as luck would have it, the very day before I'd been on KGO, I'd received a letter from a fellow researcher, Capers Thompson, who lives in Jacksonville, Florida, saying that he was coming to California and that he would come visit me. He wanted to come up here and see the research and meet. He subscribes to these tapes, and he's getting out a newsletter soon to start himself called the King Alfred Research Newsletter. And in his letter, Capers said, I'm bringing you books on the Metro Plan, that my newsletter will be about the Metro Plan. So I didn't have to search very far. When I was through talking to Bob Trevor on the air, I had this letter here that I hadn't even read from the day before, and Capers said that he would be here. He was here this last week as a house guest. He came up to Carmel and spent a few days and brought me books on the Metro Plan, and we did a 2-hour radio show with Bob Trevor. And I told the people on the air that I would give them the information that they could order this themselves. Now, this Capers Thompson, who's getting out the newsletter, I have his address here on the printed sheet that's going out with tape 338, so you can follow up on this, is doing a project on the King Alfred Plan. And those of you that have tape number 319, that was April 30th of this year, know in length about the King Alfred Plan, and I won't repeat it again on this tape because this is an ongoing series, and those of you who have this particular tape cassette will have to back order that one. You have the list of shows. It was on KLRB April the 30th, Dialogue Conspiracy 319. And the important part of the King Alfred Plan was the dividing of the United States regional planning for genocide, a map of dividing the country into 10 regions. And I've included in the corner of the sheet that comes with this tape today that regional plan for genocide on page 373, The Man Who Cried I Am. I like the method of getting the tapes out to you an hour a week. I hope you do too. And I can include this information where the other broadcasts used to go too fast. And I hope and I know you appreciate it because I'm getting mail about it. I think it's a better format. You have a little corner of that map. Well, the Metro Plan is described in several books that Capers brought to me. And I have given them here so that you can order them yourself because there's no sense using the whole tape time to go into the details of the books. You can put your hands on them and order them and share them with other people. The important thing, I'll go down a few points that I got from reading these books, and then I've ordered them now for myself. He brought some out, and I'm ordering more. I've listed the Metrocrats. It seems there's a woman, Jo Hinman, who publishes out of Idaho. I've given you her home address in Oregon, who spent 15 years studying this intent to remove our constitutional rights through these regions instead of having a government in Washington. She spent 15 years on that, just as I've spent 15 years on these various assassinations and conspiracies. Jo Hinman's address is here. You can write to her. You can order the book from the publisher in Idaho. And then Phoebe Courtney, another woman, has another book called Beware Metro and Regional Government, and I've given this address and where you can get that, and a book, Federal Register Blueprint for Tyranny. It's interesting that the John Birch Society is publishing a lot of this literature, just like the National Labor Caucus publishes the material on Jimmy Carter and the Trilateral Commission. It's too bad that all of us from all spectrums of life, people think the Labor Caucus is a far right-wing group, and they are lined up with the far right at this time. But whatever the title of the organization, if the information is true and valid, it's useful. There are many things that the Birch Society publishes that are very valid and useful, and I use them and give them credit for it. Somebody challenged the Birch Society publishing this kind of material on the air, Bob Trevor's show. And if the facts are right and they're delving into the facts, we'll eventually end at the same place. If people are honest about their research, we will have to end with the same conclusions or find out at what point we vary and then what becomes mass propaganda as against hard research. But these books that I've listed for you, you can order, and I've ordered, the Metrocrats, Beware of Metro and Regional Planning. And the important thing, linking the Metrocrat work of primarily research, I guess, from the starting with the John Birch Society or the conservative right, is that they come up with these books on dividing the United States into these 10 sections. And The Man Who Cried I Am has these divisional sections. Now, The Man Who Cried I Am, I've listed the pages below to repeat for those of you that didn't catch it on the other show, but you should read the book. Pages 371 to 376 call for the final solution of vaporizing all blacks in the United States. But it's got a program of breaking all black leaders, which they've done, killing the top leaders, which the federal government has done, breaking up the organizations, which they have done. And then one of their final solutions before the very end is to make their most noticeable black leaders ambassadors. So we have Ambassador Young traveling around and then being discredited by the media for every statement that he says, such as on the American prisoners, which happen to be true. We do have our political prisoners here, like in Russia. And there's a concerted effort to keep the black people from holding public office. I heard Bobby Baker on KGO talking about Adam Clayton Powell. There were things that Lyndon Johnson did and Bobby Baker that were much worse than what Adam Clayton Powell did, but Powell was removed from Congress, the black congressman, for his misdeeds, in quotes, misdeeds. That today Congressman Hayes can get reelected for the same things that Clayton Powell was doing, or worse. Because he was a black man, they went after him. Senator Brooke will probably be removed from the Senate, a black man from the Senate. Shirley Chisholm was pushed out by a so-called liberal in New York and was removed from the congressional use of her. She's no longer in the House or the Senate, and she should never have given up her House seat. She should have stayed for the Senate, but I'm sure that some bad advice got her to change her political goals and go higher, and that's when she was pushed off. Julian Bond isn't running for office next year, and Barbara Jordan was used by the trilateralists, and Mr. Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter at the Democratic Convention. She got standing ovation, an eloquent speaker, congresswoman, and when Jimmy Carter was in office, out came the saber-rattling warmongers, and Barbara Jordan is not running for office, neither is Julian Bond. A black gentleman in this very area ran for airport board this last election and was defeated and told me he wanted to run in 1980. And just yesterday, two white men invited him to lunch. He had coffee with them, and he went out, and they told him that no black man would ever hold office for airport board in Monterey, California. And, of course, he was aghast and could hardly believe it, and said, wait, this isn't the South, and these aren't the slave days, and various public officials are black and are making it. And he quoted, like Julian Bond, and I told him, and he wasn't even aware that Bond has declared that he's not running for public office. I think he's going to work for some broadcasting company or business or as a lobbyist. And I suggested this person write, he knows Julian Bond, and find out if, in fact, all the visible black leaders like Senator Brooke and Shirley Chisholm, Julian Bond, and Barbara Jordan, and even Mr. Patterson of our airport group here who wanted to run on the board there, if this is a national problem, which is taking place in 50 states. Is this a concerted effort to take every little person, not as well known as Barbara Jordan and Julian Bond, and just take them aside and have a cup of coffee and say, you know that no black can have that office? Now, I bring that up because the Metro Plan has divided the country into regions, and the King Alfred Plan has divided the country into 10 regions. And do they overlay? Is this part of the same plan? Are they synchronized? I also heard from some fairly good sources that I'm checking out in Atlanta, Georgia, that various black women have been aborting children and having miscarriages and going to their obstetrician only to find out that they had been given a shot of some kind and that they're being sterilized. And this is going on right now in Atlanta, Georgia, among the blacks. And so that the regional division of the Metrocrats, which is taking place, is a 10-region division such as the King Alfred Plan. And seeing what's happening to the blacks in this country physically and psychologically and politically, it makes the Metro Plan even more dangerous if they're all synchronized together. Now, the Metro Plan, the book The Metrocrats, talks about in 1938, a new building was put up in Chicago, 1313 East 60th Street. And of course, I'm keeping a chronological record in a book for each year since 1918 to see how this fascism or this Nazification process is taking place. 1938 was an important year. Of course, this was the time of right after the plot to seize the White House was blown in 1934. 1933, Hitler was in 1938. He was well on his way almost to invade Poland, financed by Henry Ford and the American industrialists and the Morgans and people from the United States. He was our bulwark against the communists. But plans were afoot in this country that were laying the seeds for the fascism, the fifth column that could be here, just like it had taken South Africa and France and Italy. And Adolf Hitler's men had gone into Latin and Central America and South America and Asia. So there's no reason to believe that they weren't firmly entrenched in the United States, particularly since so much of the funding for Hitler came over here. And in 1938, a building was put up in Chicago under the grant from the Spellman Fund. This is interesting because I think of Cardinal Spellman and later the role of the Jesuits and the Catholics in taking the Nazis out of Germany, the Nazi war criminals, the Bormans and so forth, into Italy and then Spain, and then to be dispersed all over the world. The purpose of this building under these grants was to provide headquarters for the use and occupancy of the national government. An agency would be set up. It would be a clearinghouse at 1313 East 60th Street. The Public Administration Clearinghouse, it was called. And some of the financiers behind it were the Carnegie Corporation, the Sears Roebuck Fund, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all to become CIA foundations. We didn't have the CIA in those days. Well, we had the OSS, but we had the international bankers and the people that had put Hitler into power. And these various foundations later, as I say, were conduits and fronts for the CIA, and the 1313 plan was on its way. In February 1972, February the 10th, 1972, that was 4 to 5 months before Watergate in June, the federal, in quotes, Richard Nixon passed what he said were federal regions that were to be run by 10 federal regency councils. Americans' unelected rulers, according to the book The Metrocrats, set up by the Council of Foreign Relations, had a branch for economic development in the United States. The Council of Foreign Relations was for overseas investment and protection and foreign policy that would provide profits for investments. And the CED, the sister of the CFR, the Council for Economic Development, set up these offices in Chicago. And in 1972, Richard Nixon had set up this regional plan as law, February the 10th, 1972. Of course, the 1972 in June, James McCord said that the reason that he was blowing the whistle on the Watergate defendants and not just pleading that he was guilty and it went no further than them is that he feared a German Gestapo in this country. Don't take that lightly, a German Gestapo, when it comes from James McCord, who worked in the Central Intelligence for 21 years. It was Dan Smoot of the Birch Society again, who wrote in 1959 about the 1313 building, East 60th Street, Chicago. He says, this is a national center for the production of experts to fabricate progressive legislation for government at all levels, to rewrite our Constitution, and to take over city managers, county managers, and metropolitan managers. In essence, it was to set up a plan whereby we have a system of experts. We use these think tanks that have been named by various organizations, and particularly the RAND and in the East. I can give you a list of the think tanks that are considered dangerous and linked to this particular kind of office in the Chicago area. And in come the experts. And these experts aren't elected by anybody. They can't be voted out of office. The public officials lean on them. The cabinet members in Washington, D.C. lean on them. If there's any scandals, they're not accountable. They can give wrong information about who to invade or what's safe or where our country should invest or where we should go to war, but they're accountable to nobody. They simply are think tanks that set up experts, and the experts are called in. Then the danger is that these experts are used by our governors, by our state legislatures, by the chief justices, the Supreme Court, mayors, state attorney generals, state city managers, and every office holder can call in and quotes experts. And then the experts push legislation, and the congressman hasn't got time to look into it, so that all this masterminding is going on by the think tanks in these various locations. Now, 1313 East 60th Street in Chicago is the nerve center of the Metro Plan. But the big boss, again, is in New York City, right across the street from the Council of Foreign Relations. That's the National Municipal League, NML. It's called National Municipal League, 1313 East 60th Street in New York City. And it's interesting because the Metrocrats says that the offices in Chicago, the nerve center, is 1313 East 60th Street in Chicago, and the nerve center in New York City is 1313 East 60th Street in New York City. Is it possible that these people are such dummies that they have to have the same address in case they get lost in New York City or Chicago, or is that just a coincidence? But as I say, some of these institutes like RAND and Stanford Research and the Brookings, these think tanks, call in experts, and then they go out to the regional government, and regional government, according to Joe Hinman, who's done the work, is a violation of the United States Constitution, and she has been before Congress and testified to that effect, because the sovereign power is to reside in the people who elect members of Congress, and they should be accountable to the people. The problem with Richard Nixon's regional councils is that the government, it would literally be set up in 10 federal regions, and it would be administered by federally appointed persons in 10 regions, and not by Congress back in Washington, D.C. Of course, the original plans to do away with the Constitution made Congress ineffectual anyway, because this plan came out headed by Mr. Tugwell from Columbia University, again, the home place of Mr. Brzezinski. They probably worked hand in glove there at Columbia, and the new Constitution that I have written about in my realist articles deals with doing away with the Senate. The Senate would be appointed by the current president, by it would be public officials who had been in office once and retired, and the House of Representatives would be 500 members, but only 100 would be elected at large out of the various regions. The Metro Regional Plan, as I say, divides the country into these areas, and at the local level, there are 10 sections. The United States is divided into 10 sections, and the city and the county and the state, as we know it in the United States, would be abolished, and we would have these individual regions. So instead of 50 states, we have 10 areas. Of course, the thing that makes this so scary and makes it possible, and you can't say impossible, is the fact that the overlaying 10 areas is identical to the 10 sections of the King Alfred, and the King Alfred Plan seems to be working, and the Metro Plan seems for all purposes to be something in the wings waiting to be put to use. It was Dornberger, Chief Justice Dornberger, that I also mentioned in a Realist article, who helped write the new Constitution that would be used, whereby we would do away with trial by jury. And yet, after he wrote that, he was made the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, even though he went on record and made it very clear that we need a new Constitution, and that when it comes, we eliminate trial by jury. The Metro Plan means metropolitan governments, and again, it was Gary Allen in American Opinion who said that this entire area then would be run by experts, and they would have the power and would not be accountable to the people. Of course, these little insidious plans that are funded by multi-million-dollar foundations are working. They can affect our lives, and there is an example I also gave on KGO of how the Metro Plan works at local areas. There's regional planning right here now on the coast of Big Sur and in our own immediate area, and there's an artist, Emil Norman, very fine artist, who has a home down at Big Sur, and he has 40 or 50 acres with a private road up to his home. It's his own private property. He's had it for quite a few years and didn't inherit it. He bought it through hard work and selling his own art. And he has a caretaker and family living on the property, living in a trailer, and he wanted to build a wood structure in place of the trailer, not to increase the population on his acreage, he's just up there alone, but to allow them to move from their trailer into a real structure. And he took it to the Board of Supervisors. It goes to the Planning Commission. Emil Norman was turned down at first and had a large hearing where a lot of wealthy, influential people in the area stood behind him, and the conditions of his adding this house instead of a trailer was that he open his road through his property and have access for people to go to the beach and walk through his property or use it, passing way, that he couldn't no longer have private property down at Big Sur, but there had to be an open passage for the public to get to the beach. And the condition by which he could transfer a trailer for a wooden house was that the public have access to his land and walk through it, possibly camp there, start fires, and so forth. Now, access on his property had nothing at all to do with exchanging one structure for the other. But this is regional planning, and the hearing took place in Santa Cruz, and it was turned down, and he won the case. But the most important thing was that this man had the support of the most wealthy, prominent people in the area, and they all went to bat for them, several hundred people. But imagine what's going to happen to private property or the rights of people when planning areas, large planning areas, come in and dictate, literally dictate, how you change your lifestyle or what you do with it or how you use your investment, and take away from you the right to even add one little matchbox or an animal shelter, or maybe change a dwelling or add a room to your house without reconstructing your property. It's frightening, and I use it as an example on KGO to show how the Metrocrats can work and the experts come in, and this regional planning begins to take over. And we see it in our own local area, and I'm sure you can. But I see the danger that is written up in these books on the Metrocrats, the list that I've given you. And I think you should order them and study them and see if any of this is happening around you, and find where your regional planning is in your own local areas. The California Journal just came out with an issue on Jerry Brown's regional planning in California, and I'm going to send for that. I think it was June 1978. The regional planning is dangerous, and of course, Governor Brown passes himself off as an alternative to Jimmy Carter, as a liberal without the trilateral. I don't want to get into Governor Brown right now. We'll do that at another time. but his tentacles go into the intelligence community also, and high up into the bowels of the Watergators and the cover-ups of the Watergators. So we get one person followed, or as a backstage, to be brought in case of emergency for the new elections, or an up-and-coming candidate. But they also are working with these Metrocrats in insidious ways that will hurt the state, and they have their influence in the state capitals. They have it here, and I'm sure you have it in your states. It's hard to watch, but it's worth reading these books and seeing what these authors are saying. Mrs. Courtney has written books, Phoebe Courtney, and she says, and quote, "So long as the Council on Foreign Relations controls our domestic and our foreign policy, regardless of what political power is in order, I will continue to expose the semi-secret policies." That's sort of the feeling I have with wanting to get started with an organization called the World Watchers. I haven't talked too much about on the tapes. I'm going to wait till summer vacation is over and then decide whether I want to push for a real national organization or whether I just want to pull back and stop entirely, except for writing articles or books, and just accumulate this information on a more private basis. If we're not going to use it and get outraged and expose these people for some of the stuff that is coming down, I can't see any further use in just keep putting it out in the air as a trial balloon or a feeler. I think the people have to get organized and get involved and do something now before it's too late, because I just don't want to sit here and watch it come down and throw the information out and not have it being used in some way. An example of it being used is we were on KGO, and Capers Thompson was on with me, and it was a quite lively show, 2 hours, and we reached a lot of people, and this week I got almost 100 letters asking for this information on the Metrocrats and so forth. But then a couple of nights later, that was Sunday night, I was driving down from San Francisco back to Carmel, listening to KGO, and Bob Trevor was on, and Ron Owen was on, and I don't know what local talk shows you have in your area, and they were bleeding for subjects. They were saying, well, what do we talk about tonight? What's happening? Let's talk about Skerensky or the Russian dissidents, the same old theme song with saber rattling. And I was waiting to see if people who take Dialogue Conspiracy or who take World Watchers now, take these tapes, would pick up the phone and just call up and talk about any one of these subjects we've talked about, to bring them out in the open, put it on the air. We talked about the King Alfred Plan. We talked about the genocide. I got a lot of mail and a lot of interest on it. But I don't know why people aren't using the airwaves or calling, writing letters to CBS or NBC and using this information. How are you going to use this information? I, as one person, can be the recipient of all this material, and I can be a conduit to pass it on to you. But I still want to know, what are you going to do with it? How are we going to use it in some way to stop this insanity and expose it before it's too late? There certainly is a conspiracy of silence. As I say, Joe Hinman, I did not ever have her address or information about her, and she probably never heard about Mae Brussell, and each of us have worked 15 years to stop a form of fascism in this country. And it's time that we got to know each other, and I'll write to her this week, and it's time that we spread this information on the airwaves. You can call radio talk shows. There's one in Florida, there's one in Atlanta, Georgia, New York City, San Francisco. I'm going to get a list of the talk shows and see how many people who get this information can't call these people and get on the air and get these opinions and feelings out in the air and let people know that some of these things are happening. Side 2 of this tape now is going to be on one of my favorite subjects, Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, and Mark Lane. This is side 2. July 21st, 1978, tape number 339. Everything is coming together so beautifully in my research now. I'm wondering whether I'm just gushing with an information overload or whether all the loose ends now are being fit into the piece of the puzzle. I really think a lot of the answers of who held back the research and where the research really should be going into the assassinations and the overthrow of this country, the suppression of it versus the facts has been a strong point in my mind to try and cover why we're driving a car full speed with the brakes on and who has the brakes. How did the media create these people, and how can we move them out of the way in order to get these truths out in our lifetime? And of course, I keep accumulating new books and new articles, just searching and searching for the answers. And my friend Lydia Blades, who did a couple of shows with me on Dialogue Conspiracy, went to San Francisco last week and came back with an amazing book that I never owned and never knew about, and I'm giving you the bibliography here so you can locate it. She paid a lot of money for it. It was published in New York City in 1947, July 1947, by a man edited by Herbert Moore and James Barrett with an introduction by W.F. Heimlich. It's edited. It isn't written. I was going to say it's written by a man named Herbert Moore. It's put together by American and British intelligence and with official reports of Russian intelligence on the death of Adolf Hitler. And of course, some of this from American intelligence I put at arm's distance. Some of this book I accept and some I reject. But parts of it are very, very interesting. And I want to share it with you and give you the bibliography here. I want as many of you to look for it and locate it if you can. I'll pay you back if you can find it. I've copied her book. It's not that long, and I have copied it so that I never lose track of it. But if ever you find it, it's put out by Book Tab Press in New York, 1947. And if you can find it for me, I'll reimburse you. I'd appreciate having one copy of my own. You know, I've done one show on Dialogue Conspiracy on the National Police Gazette issue. I've given you that address if you want to order it. The entire issue is called Hitler is Alive. And I've referred to the UFO, the book on one of the tapes. You already have that address of UFO, Hitler's Secret Weapon. I got a letter today from a researcher in Taos, New Mexico, who reminded me that the author of the UFO book about Hitler being alive is a Nazi, and I've gotten this from other sources living in Canada who published the book. Well, I can't argue with the fact that, say, a Nazi now is saying Hitler's alive. That has nothing to do with the fact that there were mysteries about his death, and everybody who's exposing it, if the Birch Society is exposing the Metrocrats, the Labor Party is exposing the Trilateral Commission, and we are on the brink of a war, and if even a Nazi is telling the world that Hitler is alive, it's up to the rest of the world to find out what in the heck is going on. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. That's like saying, the same logic of saying, well, don't believe Mein Kampf because a Nazi wrote it. Just believe what an American author writes, or a Frenchman, or an Englishman. Tell me the difference. Hitler said, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what he did. And therefore, whether Nazis are publishing these books or not isn't the important thing. But the important thing is, what was the mystery about Hitler's so-called death, and who created the death? And the thing that's important for me that runs all through this book, and entirely through this entire book called Who Killed Hitler, with all of the allegations and the information about the possibility that Hitler is still alive or left Germany at that time, the entire basis of the Western world accepting the Hitler story, the entire basis was put out by U. Trevor Roper, the Englishman. And U. Trevor Roper wrote a report in November of 1945 that became a book called The Last Days of Hitler by H.R. Trevor Roper. Now, we know Trevor Roper as an English writer, and I know him more by saying that he wrote the introduction to Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment. And this is terribly important for the work that I've done. because it was first Penn Jones Jr. in Texas that called attention that Mr. Murchison, the Texas oilman, had a large controlling stock in Holt Reinhardt that published Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment. And I've accused Mark Lane publicly, privately, of holding back the investigation of the assassinations, and I have accused him constantly of pressing the information of Clay Shaw in the OSS meeting with Reinhard Gehlen, chief of Hitler's intelligence, the Nazis, of suppressing the Michael Payne connections to Walter Dornberger, the Nazi war criminal at Bell Aerospace, the link of Lee Harvey Oswald with the Nazis, and Albert Osborne in the Mexico connections with the CIA. And I've accused Lane of hiding the Alexander Zeiger, Argentine, Lee Harvey Oswald connections, Marina Oswald, the CIA, Nazi connections from Argentine to the Minsk radio factory, to the U-2, to downing the U-2 at the time of détente of Khrushchev and President Eisenhower. I had a flyer made out in 1976, which I enclose in letters wherever I can. If you don't happen to own one, send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send it to you. It's called World, World Nazis, Walter Dornberger, Michael Payne, Lee Harvey Oswald, General Reinhard Gehlen, Clay Shaw, and Alan Dulles. And it begins, there's two sentences I wrote. Why have Mark Lane, Bernard Fensterwald, George O'Toole, Robert Sam Anson, and the Boston-based Assassination Information Bureau and the other researchers around Mark Lane protected the Nazi links to the John Kennedy assassination? How is it that Sherman Skolnick in Chicago, Jim Garrison in New Orleans, and myself, who found those Nazi agents from World War II working with Clay Shaw, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Michael Payne, are discredited and called mentally sick and crazy? Why do they hide the Payne connections to Dornberger, the Dornberger von Braun connections to the assassination, the Bell Aerospace links, the Clay Shaw links, the links of the entire Russian Solidarist Nazi connections with Lee and Marina Oswald, the Nazis from a Young Americans for Freedom that came from Germany to form the YAF with Robert Morris in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Gehlen spies in the United States? How is it that Mark Lane, the leader of this great Kennedy assassination story, was the first one to get a book out that's on all the bookshelves? He's called by the CBS, the major media, when they want to talk down the assassinations or put down the assassinations. He's the man who set up that committee in Washington, D.C., and then left town and moved into an apartment out in California while the congressional committees are going, who has suppressed these Nazis. And when you see that Trevor Roper was writing the introduction, wrote it to his book, you don't see on the book stands of the assassinations Thomas Buchanan's book, Who Killed Kennedy, Leo Savage's book, The Kennedy, or Paris Flamon's Kennedy Conspiracy, Leo Savage's book on the assassination, Joe Jostin's book, Harold Weisberg's 5 books, Whitewashes, or Penn Jones Jr., his books, Forgive My Grief. None of these sit on library shelves, maybe one or two, or the bookstores. They are always suppressed. The story was never meant to get out. Only Mark Lane is associated with the investigation of John Kennedy. On the front cover of his book is the introduction of Trevor Roper. But what he doesn't say, and what you didn't know, was that in 1945, Trevor Roper was chief of British intelligence. He was a British intelligence officer in Berlin, and that he was the sole perpetuator of the story of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committing suicide and having themselves cremated, ordering their cremation, the phony marriage story at the last moment between them. This was given to Trevor Roper. He worked with Goebbels, the minister of propaganda with Adolf Hitler. And Goebbels and Roper got out the story that Adolf Hitler was dead, and that's the one that has been perpetuated around the world all of this time. In the fly cover on both sides of this book, the fly sheet, Who Killed Hitler, edited by Herbert Moore and James Barrett, it said, "It is a fortunate coincidence for the reading public that the untold story of Hitler's mysterious death is being published at the same time as the official version. If this were not so, millions would go on believing the unsupportable story of suicide and cremation, which British intelligence constructed out of incomplete facts and half-truths. The publication of Who Killed Hitler goes into work of U.S. intelligence and private intelligence sources. The reason why 45% of the people believe Hitler is still alive will not appear strange. This was in 1947 if one reads the British report elaborated called The Last Days of Hitler by Chief Intelligence Officer of the U.S. Army in Berlin, W.F. Heimlich. He sums up and challenges Trevor Roper and says there is not one shred of evidence to prove that Hitler died by suicide. No up-to-date report on Hitler's death could be thorough that omits the findings of Russian intelligence agents who entered Hitler's bunker 50 feet below the ground. And it goes into the fact that these men went into the Russian reports, and then there's a copy of the Russian reports. The first report said they had the body, and then later they denied it and did not have Adolf Hitler's body. Chapter 18 of Who Killed Hitler has a section called the American Private Intelligence Report. None of the Allied military intelligence reports on the last days of the Nazi Berlin answered the question of who killed Hitler. The British reporter, under the name of Major H.R. Trevor Roper, accepts the Nazi propaganda version. That's the man who wrote the introduction to Lane's book. Accepted the Nazi version. Trevor Roper sticks to that legend that was originated and publicized by Dr. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, that Hitler and his bride, Eva Braun, ended their lives and were cremated in the Chancellery Garden. The several Russian reports shifted from suicide cremation theory to the possible escape and then the discrepancy, leaving the main question still unsolved, namely the circumstances of death. The escape and disappearance theory, though widely believed, comes without any independent investigation, and it is simply a Hitler legend. The British did not begin their investigation of Hitler mystery until 5 months after his death. In the foreword of the book, Chief Intelligence Officer for the U.S. Army in Berlin said, "I was assigned to find Adolf Hitler or his body immediately upon the entry of American troops into Berlin, and I state positively I didn't find Hitler or his physical remains. Despite a thorough search of the area, we have found no evidence that the body was burned, and you cannot locate any person who witnessed the last days of the Chancellery. Because of the activities of British and American intelligence were carried on a joint basis, it was personally astounding to learn that British Major H.R. Trevor Roper issued what was purported to be an official account of Hitler's last days without ever consulting any American colleagues. During my stay in Berlin, I lived with the Chief of British Intelligence. I shared their knowledge of the experts on the probable fate. I cannot overstress the fact that I have never been able to find any reliable witness of Hitler's activities after April 22, 1945, 9 days before the date of his supposed suicide. Under these circumstances, I could never understand on what basis Trevor Roper based his official British intelligence report. He wrote it November the 1st, 1945, and this was when the bomb crater in the garden of the Reich Chancellery went off, and the area wasn't even evacuated or excavated for investigation until December the 12th, 1945, 7 months after the surrender of Berlin. I feel that the melodramatic fabrication that was advanced by Dr. Goebbels and accepted in toto by Major Trevor Roper, the theory of suicide by Hitler and Eva Braun, followed by cremation, is impossible. The stories told by the two SS guards, Hermann Krenau and Erich Mansfield, is not plausible or credible. Both were unreliable. They're not familiar with the area or the bunker layout. When questioned thoroughly, they betrayed their lack of knowledge, even the direction of the entrance of the bunker. It is the opinion of qualified experts that you can't completely destroy a human body burn it in the open air without a trace of a single ash, and this was what happened in the case of Adolf Hitler. Despite the search, I've never been able to find any evidence to support that theory of love and marriage of Hitler and Eva Braun. That story was created of their actions between April 26th and April 9th, was told by a German woman aviator, Hanna Reich, and it does not jive with reliable sources, and it can be easily discredited. My own conclusion, this is the introduction to this book, written July 5th, 1947, is that after April 22nd, 1945, everything is a mystery as far as Hitler's fate is concerned, and that mystery will linger until the corpse of Adolf Hitler has been found and certified beyond any doubt. Then the book goes into private intelligence report again, how the Allied military intelligence, the last days of the Berlin capture, were confused. The British report, again, was written by Major A.R. Trevor Roper, who accepted this Nazi propaganda, and there were glaring defects in the British intelligence investigation. He said it became more and more apparent on the anniversary of Hitler's death that the legends of his escape and survival would reappear. Now, this was written in 1947, and on the anniversary of Adolf Hitler's death in April of this year, of 1978, Mr. Wagner, the head of the Treblinka and the other concentration camp in Poland, responsible for over 1 million deaths, was arrested at a birthday party for Adolf Hitler. Now, that was written up in the New York Times as being a birthday party for Adolf Hitler. It didn't say in commemoration of his birthday or the late Adolf Hitler. In the book, Who Killed Hitler, he goes on again on November the 1st, 1945, British Major H.R. Trevor Roper issued a report without, again, ever consulting the U.S. intelligence. Trevor Roper was not the officer originally assigned to evaluate the British findings. He came in as a volunteer on September the 9th, 1945, at the suggestion of a friend. You remember that as soon as John Kennedy was killed, Mark Lane flew immediately to Dallas as a volunteer to help that Russian widow, to show her in America how kindly and great we are. And Marina Oswald sent a message, I don't need him, my husband was guilty. Mark Lane had a few verbal contacts and saw Marguerite Oswald, who said my son was an agent, and Mark Lane does not work with Marguerite Oswald. He's never written a book about her information. He's not interested in what she knows. He now has Grace Stevens staying with him in Santa Monica, California, a witness to the Martin Luther King assassination, where James Earl Ray stayed at the rooming house. But when I saw this about Trevor Roper, and I thought about Mark Lane going right to Europe and writing a book on the assassination without possibly going through the 26 volumes, I think of how he volunteered to come out and help Marina Oswald, and how for 15 years he suppressed this information. And I knew in time, as we follow these pieces, the mystery of Mark Lane, who Mark Lane is, where he came from, and why he's doing this, will all fall into place. Remember, it's only been 14 years since John Kennedy was killed, and as long as I live, I have endless patience, and I hope those who take these tapes, duplicate these tapes, and send them to friends and relatives and the news media, and ask about Trevor Roper. With this in mind, I reread his introduction to Rush to Judgment, and I went through Mark's book again, just really quickly, to see if he were a deep cover agent and were perpetuating this Oswald story, why at this time, and how much information were they giving out? If Trevor Roper was an officer in British intelligence in the 40s, and he's writing in 1964 in Mark Lane's book, what did he say in the introduction? Did he give any information? And the thrust of the introduction is Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't be found guilty in a court of law. Lee Harvey Oswald, the evidence wasn't against him. The Warren Commission tried him and sentenced him, and Jack Ruby killed him. And that given a new trial, Lee Harvey Oswald would be innocent of the crime. Now, all of that is wonderful, because I believe Lee Harvey Oswald is innocent of the crime. I also believe that Lee Harvey Oswald's double could be and was substituted, and that's a different subject when the shooting took place in the Dallas police basement. I believe that John Wilkes Booth was able to escape after the Lincoln assassination. His body wasn't found, and the various conspirators were hung, and Booth went to India. I believe that's possible as new information's come out. I believe the Russian Tsar's family could be allowed to leave, and no traces of their body were found. I believe one of the biggest stories in the country, a book to write up, is the hoax burials or the substitutes for, say, John Wilkes Booth, the Tsar's remains, Adolf Hitler's remains, the Howard Hughes remains, the Lee Harvey Oswald burial, and go into some of these grand escapes and how these situations are perpetuated. And it could be that Mark working to find Lee Harvey Oswald innocent so that when he comes back, his record would be clear. But getting back to the book, Who Killed Hitler, I won't be able, naturally, on 1/2 hour of a tape to go into much of it, and I hope you can get it. If not, I may do part 2 of the tape next week on some more of this book, because it does say, it describes Trevor Roper, and the way his investigation of the killing of Hitler is identical to the Warren Commission investigation, although it's less complicated. He comes out with a book, similar to the way the Warren Commission came out with their book, Sloppy Investigation of a Homicide. It said Trevor Roper was not originally assigned, but he was recommended. Somebody told him to volunteer at the suggestion of a friend. Not mentioned who the friend was in 1945, but we do have books and documents now that from 1943 on, the Nazis were getting ready to settle and move around the world and were getting ready for the takeover. So they may have had a good friend suggest how to investigate this death. It said, although it was a complex task to investigate the death of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, Trevor Roper made a hasty study of the evidence already compiled by British intelligence. He dashed off his own conclusions. He spent 7 weeks issuing what became the official intelligence report on the death of Hitler. He skipped essential eyewitness testimony. He displayed a gross ignorance of the full names of key persons. Worst of all, it is revealed by Mr. Heimlich that no evacuation was done in the bomb crater until after his book was out. He came out in November, and the evacuation of this bomb crater took place December the 12th, 1945. Thus, Trevor Roper wrote the official British report without even examining the site of the pretended burial. Asian American authorities, according to the authors of this book, might have overcome their initial handicap to a large extent if they had instituted immediate and thorough investigation into Hitler's death and not merely using military intelligence. This is the same military intelligence, of course, that set up Adolf Hitler and was allowing the Nazis to escape. And this author is wondering why they didn't go into it immediately and thoroughly. Why didn't they use historians, regular historians, but they used instead military intelligence agents or historians from Army duty? Does that sound like the Warren Report, where Otto Winokur from Germany maybe still is, the chief historian of the Pentagon, and they sent in Mr. Coakley and Goldberg from the Army? Well, Adolf Hitler's death was investigated by the military and the historians from the Army, and well-trained specialists in the sciences of collecting evidence and interrogating and cross-examining witnesses were not used. And of course, that was used, the same pattern of the autopsy of John Kennedy and the investigation of the car, the writing of Lee Harvey Oswald on the diary, the body of Lee Harvey Oswald that was exhumed and cremated by orders of the Warren Commission, a duplication of the same pattern done by the same persons. Now, this author says instead of being quick and precise and cross-examining and interrogating and collecting, the slow start in investigating Hitler and the uncoordinated effort made it possible for the Russians to preserve their initial advantage, and future they could open up the rebirth of Nazi mythology and Hitler worship. Now, what these authors are claiming, and of course a lot in their book I don't take so seriously, but the Trevor Roper material and the way that Hitler's death was investigated can be looked up and documented. What they're saying in this book is that because the British were so sloppy and Trevor Roper was so sloppy, the story of Adolf Hitler being alive could be perpetuated by the Russians. But take that one step further. Is everyone a communist who says, like Mae Brussell now, let's go to the Antarctica and see if Adolf lived? Let's call these public officials, Mr. Colby, Richard Helms, James Angleton. Some of them, many of them are still alive, that were running the CIA then. The OSS became the CIA. Let's find out. Walter Dornberger, I believe, is alive. We know Werner von Braun is dead. But there are many, many people that could be called and challenged. Even Richard Nixon's law offices that brought in the head of the Odessa, Alexander Moloxai, in 1950, and then down to Argentina to continue the network of Nazis. This book, Who Killed Hitler, has a section on the American intelligence. It has a section on British intelligence and Russia. And then it continues again on the official British report. It says the British intelligence lapped in their miscalculations. The slip nearly cost Britain freedom once when they were going into Hitler's strategy. Their second big miscalculation of British intelligence is all too apparent in the official report of Major H.R. Trevor Roper. He didn't spend enough time. This is like the Warren Report. He had the facilities to get the whole story, again like the Warren Report. Instead, he brought back an essay of probabilities. Now, that's what Mark Lane was accusing the Warren Commission of doing, an essay of probabilities. And yet the man who wrote the introduction to his book has been accused of hiding the most heinous possible escape on planet Earth. What will be the consequences to the minds of democracy? They asked in 1947. The legend of Hitler dying a hero in the bunker brought a lot of satisfaction to some people that he was tucked away. But the ghost of Hitler is already walking. Many headline-fed people in Europe and America now will be expecting that Fuhrer to be talking, shouting, rallying in a new plot against humanity. Much of the blame for the affairs will be on Trevor Roper for his ineffectual efforts. Americans might have done a better job, but they relegated this to their British comrades in arms. The Russian intelligence agents had a golden opportunity to get the real facts before the trail of Dr. Goebbels' stagehands and accomplices had grown cold. But the Red agents also bungled it badly. And I wonder if Reinhard Gehlen was waiting 2 years and they were setting up the decline of Germany with orders, stall the war until we get further established, in this country and around the world. If the very Russians who bungled this investigation were the Gehlen agents behind the line, in charge also for suppressing some of this information. It says the ghost of Hitler is stalking the world. The consequence of Trevor Roper report was handed to a curious, dubious world as the last word, the full and complete official intelligence report on the death of Adolf Hitler. The Allied Supreme Headquarters bought it, hand in glove. A book came out, $3, called The Last Days of Adolf Hitler. It was released to an already confused public. I must now try to get Trevor Roper's book on the death of Adolf Hitler, his version, and also this new book, Who Killed Hitler?